When I first started out in Monster Hunter Wilds, I looked up a few video guides for beginners, things like which weapon to choose or how to use the weapons. These videos are labelled as being for new players, and they nearly all dive right into complex combos, different kinds of damage and advanced techniques to maximise your damage. It's super overwhelming and daunting, and kind of put me off the game a little bit. But now, after having played for a few hours, you don't need any of that, so I'm making a different kind of video. This guide is for players who are thinking about getting into Monster Hunter, but are intimidated by how complex and overwhelming it seems. So, first of all, and this is the most important tip, relax. Monster Hunter Wilds is probably the most approachable Monster Hunter has ever been, and it's designed to make sure you can't mess up. You can't make any decisions that will permanently ruin your character. It's not like Elden Ring, where there's limited numbers of powerful objects and you have to know what you're meant to do with them, or where bad stat choices will cause you problems later on. Everything you do is reversible, everything can be swapped out at will. Monster Hunter doesn't really have much of what you would expect from an RPG. You don't have character stats or a skill tree at all. Everything to do with your character's power and progression is based around your gear, and it can always be changed and moved about. The game really encourages experimentation, and it won't punish you for making less than optimal choices. Of course, there is a huge amount of depth in the game, and that's why so many people have loved it for like 2 decades now. But you don't need to engage with very much of it to have a good time with the game. Min-maxing is possible and will let you kill the harder monsters more efficiently and quicker, but you can get by and you can complete the entire campaign, the entire story, knowing surprisingly little about how the game works, and just delve into the guts of the game when you feel like you're interested in that. So the first thing you really need to choose is your weapon. And while every single weapon is viable in the game, and fairly early on you'll be able to choose a second weapon to take with you on hunts, I think the best choice for new players is pretty simple. It's the sword and shield. You see, every weapon in Monster Hunter has some basic attacks and then special mechanics that give them extra depth, but the sword and shield is pretty simple. You can use it just like kind of how you'd expect to use a sword and shield in any third-person action game. So you can attack using triangle Y and circle B. Broadly, triangle is kind of for the sword and circle is for the shield, but it doesn't always quite work out like that. You can guard using your shield with the right trigger, and like you'd kind of expect with smaller monster attacks, that will work fine. If you time it perfectly as a monster attack, sometimes you'll do a perfect guard, which means you won't take any damage. I don't really block that much, I tend to evade instead, and you can do that using the cross button or A on an Xbox controller. I tend to evade all the time, because when you're using the sword and shield, you're really, really fast, your stamina's super forgiving, way more forgiving than, again, something like Elden Ring, so you can just constantly keep on getting out of the way of monsters. There are combos that you can do with the sword and shield, but with this weapon, they all kind of flow into each other. Like, you can hit pretty much any random combination of attacks, and you'll probably end up doing some kind of combo. So you don't really need to learn them just to get by. All you really need to do is hit buttons, and then sometimes press triangle and circle together, or Y and B on Xbox, to kind of do this little sort of spin thing that finishes off a combo, and then if you hold those buttons together, so Y and B or triangle and circle, then you'll kind of do this attack where you do an uppercut with your sword and it'll hit the enemy lots of times. That's pretty much all you need to know to do sort of basic damage in the game. Like, that's what I use more often than not. I'll just be tapping triangle or Y to do lots of sword attacks, and then once you've done 4 of them, I'll hit the triangle and circle together to do the little spin thing, and then hold triangle and circle, and it will do the kind of uppercut. And that's really, really good, and it's really, really simple to do. The game does help you out a bunch, that when you're doing the attacks, it will kind of tell you in the top right, hey, these are other attacks that will work as like the next stage of the combo. It gives you lots of choices. And there's a training area in the game that you can use if you want to practice combos and you want to practice getting them right, but it really is much simpler than it sounds. The only other really important attack to know is that if you hold left trigger, that will kind of put you in focus mode. So you can do all your other normal attacks while holding left trigger, and it will let you kind of aim them, which is really useful in this game because the monsters do move around a lot and there's not the kind of lock-on that you'd expect from other games. But if you're holding left trigger and you see a wound, which is like a big glowing X on one of the enemies where you've injured them, if you're holding left trigger and you press RB, or R1 I think it's called on PlayStation, then you'll kind of do this special attack if you were aiming at that wound, where you'll kind of grab onto it and then you can press triangle or circle Y or B to kind of do an extra attack that will break that wound, and it'll give you some monster parts and do a bit of extra damage. That's like most of what you end up doing with Sword and Shield, is just kind of hacking at it until you create these wounds and then trying to do that. When I said you have to aim at it with left trigger, don't worry too much, it's kind of very generalized. It's super forgiving. Like if it's got an X on like its shoulder and you aim at the arm, or you aim at the chest, or you aim at the head, it will probably make it so you attach to that wound. Like it will work it out for you. As I said, the game is super forgiving about this. So there is lots more to the Sword and Shield. Once you get to grips with it, there's like much more depth to it. And it's worth watching more in-depth videos once you've learned kind of how to fight monsters normally, and then you'll realize, oh, I can do this and this will do a bit more damage, or I can do this so I can attack while evading and stuff like that. But you don't need that at the beginning. Just keep on hacking away with your sword, keep on trying to latch onto those wounds and break those, and you'll be absolutely fine. I mentioned earlier that all of the weapons in Monster Hunter have a kind of special, unique mechanic, and the one for the Sword and Shield is really, really simple. It's just, while you're holding right trigger, you can use items by pressing square or X. So whatever you've got in your item bar, you know, a potion or something like that, you can do that without having to put your weapons away first. So it's a bit quicker, which is, you know, not the most useful thing in the world, but it's nice and it's very, very simple. Now, speaking of items, this is another area of the game that looks incredibly daunting when you first start out. You can basically ignore most of them. You get given, at the very beginning of the game, you get given loads and loads of items, and you'll see you've got all different kinds of berries, and you've got different kinds of like ammo and traps and things like that. Don't worry about them. Like, the main thing you need to worry about is that health potions will give you health. You get like different versions of them, different strengths of them, but it's super obvious. There's meat, which will be like things like rations or well-done steaks. That's useful for, so if you've noticed your health bar or your stamina bar, even when it's filled up, isn't as big as it was, that's because you need to eat. So when you eat something, it will kind of restore them back up to the maximum length that they're meant to be. Every other item will get shown to you in a quest at some point, or just isn't that important. There's also things like, you know, you have this grappling hook thing that you're using. It teaches you how to use that in the tutorial of the game, and sometimes when you're fighting monsters, there'll be like some rocks you can pull down on it or something like that. Again, it will help you do more damage, but it's not super important. It's not something to worry about. Like with most things in the game, it's just added depth for when you want to start kind of maximizing your tools, but it's not essential to get through the game. There's two other mechanics that you probably do need to understand in gameplay. The first, and I don't think this is super obvious, and I don't think the game does a great job of explaining it, is weapon sharpening. Any bladed weapon, so like your sword, will get dull during a fight. Like, it happens really, really quickly. And there's this meter in the top left that will, like, it looks like a little sword, and the bar will go down. And once it starts going orange and then red, some of your attacks will just bounce off the enemy because your sword isn't sharp enough to break through. So you need to sharpen it. You have a tool in your bag, a sharpening stone. It's infinite. It's not a consumable. You're not going to use them up or anything like that. But if you use it in a fight, you'll be standing still for quite a long time while you sharpen your sword, and you'll probably get attacked by the monster. So what you want to do instead is to use the other mechanic, which we haven't talked about yet, which is the secret, I don't know how you call them. They're the big birds, basically, the big chickens that you ride around on. To get those in a fight or anywhere, just tap up on a D-pad, and then the bird will run over to you, and you can kind of hop onto its back, and it will start running around. You can use items while on the back of the bird. That's kind of their main purpose in battle. So you can run around the boss while sharpening your sword. You can just select it, press LB or L1, and then press either square and circle or X and B on the Xbox controller to look through your inventory, through your item bag in the bottom right corner, until you get to the sharpening stone. and then you can just press X to use the sharpening stone while you're on the back of the bird. There is actually a shortcut in the game for this, so if you hold LB or L1 and then you just sort of move up on the right stick, that will use your sharpening tool, and if you go left on it, that will use a health potion. So that's kind of handy. But anyway, while you're on the back of your bird and running around the boss, that's a much safer way to sharpen your weapon. And then when you want to get off it, if you press Y and B or triangle and circle together when you're on a bird, you'll actually jump off and do an attack, so you can get a little bit of extra damage in. But yeah, that's basically it. So when you're fighting monsters, what you're doing is just trying not to get hit by the monster, try to do as much damage as you can with your attacks, break runes. When your weapon gets too dull, make sure you sharpen it, probably by riding around on your bird. And then the animals, the monsters you're fighting, will do a few different things. When they're fighting you, most of their attacks are pretty well signposted. Like, they will do stuff like, they'll lift up their tail, and then that means they're going to swing down their tail, so stay away from that. Or they'll lift up one claw, and that means they're going to attack with it. Just try to stay away from it. You can use a lot of common sense in this game. Like with things like dragons and stuff, if you're underneath them, they have a really hard time fighting you. So that's a pretty good idea. If you're fighting a monster that's got something particularly dangerous looking at the front or back of it, maybe stay away from those. And you'll learn very quickly, like most monster fights involve a few minutes of you kind of getting beaten up basically by the monster, while you learn which attacks do a lot of damage, which attacks you need to run away from, that kind of thing. And then once you've got to grips with it, and normally most monsters only have a handful of attacks, they don't have that many, then you can start working out, okay, this is when I can attack, this is the side of the monster I can really easily attack, and then you can get on with it and do that. Sometimes different things will happen with the monster, so sometimes they'll get stunned. You can, if you bash them with your shield a lot, that's doing stunning damage. Any blunt weapons will stun them. And if you manage to stun them, they'll kind of fall on their side, so that's a good opportunity to do loads of damage. And also, normally, sort of 2 or 3 times per fight, the monsters will run away, and that's a good time to jump on your chicken, sharpen up your weapons, chug a potion if you need it, and then chase after the monster. You can actually sharpen the stone while you're chasing after the monster. Sometimes some of the monsters are quite slow, and you can actually keep tapping Y or triangle to kind of slash at them as they're running and get some free damage in. But they'll basically run to a different arena where you'll keep on fighting them. Sometimes you can also chop bits off monsters, usually tails. You'll like chop off their tail if they've got a big prominent tail, and just by using the sword near their tail, obviously. When the monster runs away from that area, make sure you remember to go and scavenge the tail. So if you press square or X on the Xbox, then you can put away your weapon and you can go and press B or circle to like scavenge it. And if you pick up the tail, that's a crafting material. It's one of the sort of rarer bits off a lot of enemies because it's a bit of a pain to get it. And that can be used to craft stuff. And then when you finally do beat the monster, when you finally kill the monster, again, there'll be like this weird mission timer countdown thing. Just make sure you put away your weapon and go and start scavenging the monster to get as many pieces off it as you possibly can. In the story, it's actually kind of annoying because a lot of the time you'll kill a monster and then you'll only have a few seconds to scavenge the monster before a cutscene takes you out of that area, which is really, really frustrating. So you can lose monster bits doing that. So just make sure you scavenge monsters as quickly as you can. Don't worry about if you're playing with other people, they'll have their own loot from the monster. You're not like fighting over it or anything like that. You'll each have your own loot from the monster. It's like personalized loot. So, the basic gameplay loop of the entire game is that you follow the story quests or you sign up for side missions, and that will lead you to fighting monsters in those quests. And you gather materials from those monsters to make new gear that will make you more powerful so you can fight stronger monsters. While you're on hunts, you can see there's loads of other stuff like mushrooms and herbs and honey and bugs. Just collect everything you possibly can. If your bag gets full, you can go to any of the tents that you'll end up setting up, or you can go back to your main base and use your item box and just dump stuff in there, or you can sell it. It doesn't really matter because you can always get more, but just keep on picking everything up. Over time you end up learning kind of what's more important, so I prioritize things like herbs and honey because that lets you auto craft potions. Just as soon as you have enough herbs and honey, you will automatically make some extra potions if you've got space for them. And then there's a lot of stuff, like a lot of the bugs and stuff, I just kind of ignore because they're more used for ammo and stuff, which I don't really use. So you learn what's important. Bones and rocks are quite good early on because that lets you make some weapons that do quite a lot of damage. Then once you get back to base, you can visit the blacksmith, and then that will let you forge new weapons, armor, and gear for your palico. And when you're doing this, there's a lot of stats on the page, but again, it's kind of depth for people that want it. You don't need to worry about most of it. For weapons, pay attention to the damage amount and the element type. So some monsters are weak to certain elements. It's all pretty self-explanatory. You know, so maybe there'll be a fire monster and you can use a water element weapon and you'll do extra damage to them or extra status effects. Some of the elements are more like they will just have a status effect on pretty much everything. Like, you know, you can poison them or you can paralyze them and stuff like that. That will mean often those weapons do a bit less damage. But, you know, if you can paralyze a monster, that will give you a time where it's standing still and you can do tons of damage to it at once. That can be super useful. For armor, just pay attention to the defense stat. Like primarily at the beginning, just worry about the defense stat. A bigger number is better. You can also play dress up a bit and try and make something that looks cool if you want to. Every piece of armor in this has kind of two different versions, which I thought at the beginning was meant to be like a male and female version, but I'm not sure if it is. There's just different looks, but they have the same stats anyway, so you can choose which ones you want, how you want your character to look. There are extra stats that are kind of useful, like elemental resistances, again obvious, fire resist against something that breathes fire, and there's also set bonuses and special skills. You don't need to worry about them early on, but as you go on you might realize, oh okay, there's some bonuses I want, like it'll let me sharpen my weapon quicker or make potions do more healing or something like that, or let you do some extra damage. And so it's worth having like a full set of gear from one particular type of monster. I tend to go back to the blacksmith after every new monster hunt. So every time I fight a new monster, I'll go back to the blacksmith because you might find you can make some new armor, or you can make some more gear for your palico that uses the same crafting materials as well, or you might be able to make a new weapon. Not all monsters will give you crafting materials that will work for your weapon. So sometimes you'll fight where, like using the sword and shield, around the kind of third area of the game, you'll realize that you've fought a bunch of monsters in a row where you can't actually make any new weapons from them. So that kind of sucks. But there's nearly always a new piece of armor. I think there's like an armor set for every type of monster in the game, as far as I've seen so far at least. So there's always a chance that you can make new armor. And sometimes the jump in power is actually pretty huge. I'm not sure if you can hear that. I just heard a bunch of seagulls being really loud flying over the house. That was a little bit weird. I don't actually live on the coast, so that's a little bit strange. Anyway, that's pretty much the basics covered. So with the information I've given you, you could probably complete the story and have an absolute blast with the game. You could have loads of fun with it, have a laugh. If you're playing with your friends, you can hunt the monsters together. That sometimes makes it a bit easier because obviously the monster's only focusing on one sort of person at a time. But you can do this game solo as well. It scales the monster's health and everything. I've been playing most of it solo and I haven't had any troubles. A lot of people in the sort of Monster Hunter community have been talking about how this game is much easier, and you know, that's annoyed some people. But that's really good for people who are new to the game because it means that you kind of can experiment more. You don't need to work out how to maximize your damage. Instead, you can just kind of use whatever feels fun to you, and then you'll probably find that it's viable, which I really like. Once you've got comfortable with the UI and the gameplay loop and the combat, then you can start experimenting with maybe other weapons, because the other weapons are all a little bit more complicated, some of them much more complicated, but they have the potential to maybe do more damage or to be really useful in particular situations. Or you could just really drill into maximizing the sword and shield. There's a lot of depth just to the sword and shield. Like some of the combos, particularly one where you kind of step back and then jump forwards and then you have to hit the Y button or the triangle button whenever you glow red to do more damage, and then that throws you into the air and you can do more stuff. And sometimes you might want to focus on using your shield to stun the enemy, or focus on using your blade to chop bits off it. There's a lot of depth to it, so you might want to focus on just trying to improve your skills with that, or you could work towards a specific perfect set of gear, or maybe get involved in trapping monsters and using different items to make battles even easier. All of that depth is a lot of fun, but the sort of point of this video is that all of that depth is kind of meaningless until you've got the basics down, until you've got to grips with the game. And thankfully in Monster Hunter Wilds, they've made that really easy. Like, it's a super accessible game that just doesn't look it. I think Monster Hunter has a reputation for being complicated, and it looks very complicated, but it's just not. It's very, very accessible. So don't be afraid to use all the resources and crafting materials that you have. You can always just go out and get more. You can always just go out and hunt a monster again to get more crafting materials, or go and find more of the bugs you need, or the rocks, or whatever. Just constantly experiment. Oh, also, stuff respawns really fast. So if you pick up bones and rocks and stuff like that, you can just go back to base and go back out, and you can just pick up all that stuff again. So it's worth using everything you find constantly, because you're never going to run out. So if you enjoyed this beginner's guide and you'd like to see more content like this, whether it's for Monster Hunter Wilds, maybe other weapons and stuff, or for other titles, maybe you'd like to see this style of guide for a different new game that's come out, let me know in the comments, because it's always good to have some ideas and see what people want. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one. Goodbye.